Hi everybody, John from PSI here at PSI Tack House with another edition of our FAQ swap series. So today we're going to be talking about the differences in LS and LT generations and what the differences are. Now some of these might seem obvious to you, and I get it, they are to people that are a little bit more seasoned, but for a lot of new customers, these might be questions they're afraid to ask. So we're going to go all the way back to 1955, and we're going to start out and break everything down by generations. And again, this is small block Chevy type stuff. So briefly, I'll talk about Gen 1. So Gen 1 is your typical small block Chevy, the 265, 1955, ended sometime in the late 90s as the Vortec engine in the OBS trucks. Then we went on to Gen 2, which was the 1992 to 1997 LT1, which was the engine that had the famed OptiSpark. Those were available in the Corvette, the Camaro, and the Caprices in various years. Then we had Gen 3, which was 97 to 2007, again, in various platforms. You'll see some overlap here. Then we had Gen 4, which was 2005 to 2020, again in various platforms. It would show up and then leave. And then lastly, the Gen 5, which is roughly 2014 to current and current production. So the first thing we're going to talk about is how these engines fired. So as many of you probably know, the Gen 1, it was just a classic distributor. You dropped it in to the back of the engine underneath the, through the hole in the back of the intake manifold, went down, engaged the cam gear, engaged your oil pump as well, and that was timed so that way as the crankshaft was rotating, it would fire those cylinders. 1992, GM had this great idea to put an OptiSpark in the vehicle, which was basically a distributor. As you can see by the red, it was mounted to where over the camshaft. As many of you probably know, it was driven by the water pump. And the downside to that was that if you looked at the inside of one of those things, it's common that they would fail. It looked like a Swiss watch inside. And it was located on the front of an engine, vibrating, and the water pump was right there. So if the water pump leaked, chances are you were going to be replacing your OptiSpark. Then we get to Gen 3. This is the first year for the LS, and we have a cam sensor now. We no longer have a mechanical distributor. We have a cam sensor located back where the original small block Chevy distributor was located, went down into the valley pan, and it picked up a signal off of the camshaft. Then we went to Gen 4. They moved the cam sensor from the valley up to the timing cover, similar to the way the OptiSpark was. And then in Gen 5, they continued with the cam sensor being in the same location. Now the other thing to note about these engines is there is, on Gen 1, Gen 2, there is no crank sensor. Yes, I realize that the 1997 LT1 had a crank sensor on it, but it wasn't for firing the engine. It had other reasons that they put that on there. But in Gen 3, Gen 4, and Gen 5, we have a crank sensor. And what that crank sensor does is that picks up the teeth on the reluctor wheel that is mounted to the crankshaft inside the engine. So on Gen 3, 97 to 07, this was a 24X crank reluctor. That crank sensor is easily identifiable because it is black. So when you look, it's located right behind the starter. You'll see the crank sensor mounted going into the block, and it'll be black. Fast forward to Gen 4s, and you have a 58X crank sensor. Now, the way you determine if this is 58X is that crank sensor is gray. So again, behind the starter, you'll see the crank sensor going into the block, it is gray. On Gen 5s, for whatever reason, they went back to black. Probably because it was cheaper, but the crank sensor, again, same location, it looks different, it has a different type of connector on it, but it is a black crank sensor. The next thing we go to when it comes to these 5 generations is induction. So obviously Gen 1, we had carburetors. Yes, there was mechanical fuel injection on certain Corvettes in the 60s, and then when we got into the 80s and the 90s, we had throttle body injection, we had TPI, but generally speaking, we had a carburetor. We get into Gen 2, now we're in port injection, and we have a mechanical throttle body with two blades on the front of it. This is a terrible depiction of it from the front. It would have 2 butterflies on it, 4 bolts holding it in. And it's mechanical in nature, which means a cable, as you step on the pedal, a cable's pulling it just like on a carburetor. Fast forward to Gen 3. Now on the LS, they went to a single blade throttle body, and that single blade throttle body had 3 bolts. So if you look at the front of the intake manifold, you'll see 3 bolts mounting it. These throttle bodies could be DBC, which is drive-by cable, just like the mechanical throttle body on your LT or on a carburetor, but they also offer drive-by wire. So the drive-by wires would be using electronics that were called a TAC module, and I'll talk a little bit more about that next when we talk about controllers. Fast forward to Gen 4, and we had a 4-bolt throttle body. Same thing, we had a single butterfly, 4 bolts mounting it. These were drive-by wire only. There were no drive-by cable applications for Gen 4. Lastly, we're going to go to the Gen 5. Again, drive-by wire only, 4-bolt throttle body. It is a different 4-bolt flange pattern, but it is a 4-bolt throttle body that's actuating those. Next, we're going to go to control. Gen 1, no ECM, no PCM. Yes, I realize they had throttle body injection, but for our purposes, we're going to say no ECM, no PCM. Get to Gen 2, and on the LTs, they ran a PCM, which stands for Powertrain Control Module, which means they put transmission and engine functions in the same module. These specific controllers ran a serial data to the OBD port in order to pull codes off the computer if you had trouble codes or data. They ran a conventional fuel injector, which was an EV1 style injector, and they ran at about 40 psi of fuel pressure. Get into the Gen 3 LS. Here comes the LS, again running a PCM. It actually looked similar in size to the one from the LT1. It still ran a serial data wire for trouble codes and for data coming off the controller. It ran a conventional injector, and they used 3 different types. They used an EV1 in most of the car applications. They ran a Multec in most of the truck applications, and then they ran an EV6 on the flex fuel setups in the mid 2000s. Now you can see they upped the fuel pressure to 58 psi roughly, as opposed to 40 psi in the Gen 2s. Fast forward to Gen 4s. Now we're getting serious. We're taking the engine and trans controls and we're separating them into an ECM engine control module and TCM trans control module. We've updated to a CAN bus data system, so now we have 2 wires that are running all that information. All those PIDs are running on an information superhighway between these controllers, between your OBD2 port, and that's what's providing a ton of data, whether it be trouble codes or informational data about the engine and transmission for your scanner or HP tuners or what have you. We're still running conventional injection, so we are running an injector in the intake manifold. And now we're strictly sticking to EV6s, and we're still at a roughly 58 psi, just like the Gen 3s. Lastly, we get into Gen 5, and this is one of the big changes when it came to the Gen 5 architecture, and that was going to direct injection. We still run an ECM and a TCM, we're still running a CAN bus information system. However, direct injection requires a bigger controller. We're running at 70 psi line pressure, which is generating 2,000 to 3,000 psi of rail pressure inside that direct injection system. So again, no conventional injector anymore, we have direct injection. And that's the major difference on Gen 5s. I'm going to go lastly to transmissions. And this again is kind of a sticking point for a lot of people that are new to the LS swap market. So obviously Gen 1, non-electronic transmissions. Obviously, yes, we get into the 90s, those throttle body injection, they put an E at the end of the 4L60. I get it, but you're still running TV cables, right? Get into Gen 2 motors, we're running 4L60Es, which are electronically controlled. We're running manual transmissions. Get into the Gen 3 LS, and again, based on platform, we can run a 4L60E, 4L80E, or a manual transmission. Get into Gen 4s. Now we got 4L60E, 4L80E, 6L80E, manual transmission. Get into the Gen 5s. No more 4-speeds unless you use an aftermarket controller, which PSI does sell. Now we're at 6L80E, 8L80E, 10L80E, and the manual transmissions. So again, as you can see here, notwithstanding the art, it's a basic breakdown of how things changed over time. And as they got newer, so as we get through generations, you're getting better fuel control, you're getting better transmission control, you're getting higher resolution on your controllers, so it can handle bigger cams, it can handle more compression, it can handle all types of additional things because the controller is getting better and better and better. And this is why you see more and more power with better fuel economy and extremely good drivability when it comes to the GM LS series, forget the Gen 2 and the Gen 1, and the Gen 5s. I hope you found this video helpful. We believe, just based on the questions we've been getting over the last 20 years, that this is probably long overdue. If you have any comments or questions, please leave them for us. Remember, wire it up, fire it up.